The dull plastic of the waiting room chair was cold, sticking slightly to the back of my thighs through the thin fabric of my skirt. In the corner, a fluorescent bulb hummed a flat, heavy sound that filled the spaces between the ticking of the wall clock. It was a routine medical appointment, 2 years after I had finally left the community. Near the exit sat a tiered plastic rack containing a thin, blue and white pamphlet. I picked it up simply because I was bored, and the magazines on the table were years old. Turning to the second page, my eyes locked onto a short paragraph listing specific behaviors. Pressuring a partner to become pregnant, refusing to acknowledge a partner's request to stop or wait, interfering with a partner's ability to make decisions about her own body. I read the paragraph once. I read it again, the black ink burning into my eyes. I pressed my thumb against the crisp, sharp edge of the pamphlet and held it there with all my weight until my nail went stark white. That paragraph was a perfect, unblinking photograph of my marriage. Every single line had been written by someone who had never sat in my wooden kitchen, never heard the low timbre of my husband's voice, never watched me fold my trembling hands in my lap and say absolutely nothing while my body screamed no. I had been out of the community for 2 years. I truly thought I understood what had happened to me. I thought the heaviest thing I carried in my new life was grief. But that afternoon, sitting in that cheap plastic chair under the buzzing light, I learned that grief was only the first room of a very dark house. Underneath that first room, there was another. And underneath that, there was a word I had never been taught, a word that held 11 years of my life inside it. But I need to begin with the surface, because the surface was built so carefully that I lived inside it for a decade without ever suspecting there was anything hidden beneath. My name is Rachel. This channel is a place where women tell the stories they were never given permission to tell. Stories from deep inside closed communities, closed marriages, closed systems. Told in the first person, told with absolute honesty, told because we learned that silence was never safety. It was just silence. If something in what you just heard made your breath catch, if a memory suddenly surfaced that you have been carrying in the dark without a name, I want you to stay for what comes next. What I found underneath the surface of my own marriage changed everything I thought I understood about my life. Subscribe if you want to be here when these stories are told. And if you feel moved to, leave a comment. Tell me, what was the first thing you discovered about your own past that made you realize the picture was not what you thought it was? One sentence is enough. Your sentence matters. From the outside, my life looked exactly like a pristine painting on a winter calendar. A white farmhouse, a sprawling green garden, crisp laundry snapping on the line. Small denim dresses, small shirts, even smaller ones underneath, always multiplying in the grass. My husband built heavy wood furniture in the workshop. I canned red tomatoes in August and sweet peaches in September, the kitchen thick with the sharp smell of vinegar and boiling sugar. I wore my white organza prayer covering, my dark apron, and my plain dress, keeping my kitchen perfectly clean. And I bore my children in the small bedroom at the back of the house, with a midwife from the community, and my mother-in-law standing like statues near the door. There were 7 children in 10 years. 7. And every single one of them was announced to the family the exact same way. Quietly, with a simple nod, without excitement, without dread, because both of those things would have been considered vanity in the eyes of the church. You simply received. You simply carried. You simply bore. That was the immutable shape of a faithful woman's life, and I wore that heavy shape the way I wore my long dress, without ever questioning whether it actually fit the woman inside. To understand how a woman loses the rights to her own skin, you have to step back to the beginning. You have to understand the weight of the air inside a closed community. The Ordnung was not just a set of rules written on paper. It was the very floor beneath our feet. From the time I was a little girl helping my mother scrub the linoleum, the language of refusal was systematically weeded out of my garden. We were taught that a woman's body was not her own property. It belonged to the church, to the lineage, and ultimately to her husband. Birth control was a word spoken only in hushed, scandalous whispers about the English world. A form of murder and arrogant interference with the hand of God. My husband, David, was not a monster. He did not drink, he did not gamble, and he never once raised his voice to a scream. He had quiet, steady eyes and hands that always smelled faintly of fresh cedar shavings and linseed oil from the workshop. On winter evenings, while the wind rattled the window panes, he would sit by the wood stove and patiently carve small wooden horses for the boys, his thumbs rough against the smooth pine. He brought me a cup of black coffee every single morning. Before the sun broke over the eastern fields, setting it on the table without a word, while I sat in the dim light nursing the newest infant. He believed he was a good provider, a faithful leader, and for a very long time I believed it too. I did not know that a marriage could look entirely peaceful on the surface and still slowly erase the person inside. The true turning point did not happen all at once. It was a slow accumulation of nights where the silence became a wall. I remember the night after our third child was born. The baby was only 4 weeks old, snoring softly in the bassinet beside our bed. My body was still raw, still bleeding steadily. Not the heavy rush of delivery, but the persistent, aching reminder that the internal wound had not yet healed. The room was freezing, the air thick with the scent of wood smoke and baby spit up. When I climbed back under the heavy wool quilt, David reached for me. His hand was warm against my hip, his touch familiar and unhurried. I froze under the weight of his arm. In that moment, my internal monologue was a frantic, chaotic scramble. I thought, my skin feels like fire. I am still bleeding. I am so incredibly tired. But the language available to me had no words for refusal. A good Amish wife does not withhold herself. To say no was to sin against his headship, to invite temptation into the home, to prove that my faith was fractured. So I did what I had been trained to do. I smoothed my nightgown, I nodded into the dark, and I stayed completely still. Outwardly I complied, inwardly I left. That was the night I learned how to separate my mind from my flesh. I slid somewhere far behind my own eyes, floating up to the dark corner of the ceiling, watching the silhouette of the woman in the bed below do what was expected of her. His voice was soft when it was over, a quiet murmur against my neck. Gentleness without explicit permission is a strange, confusing thing. It mimics care so perfectly that you end up blaming yourself for the hollow ache left behind. By the 5th pregnancy, the exhaustion had settled deep into my bones, a heavy gray fog that never lifted. I remember standing in the dimness of the barn one autumn afternoon, the air smelling of dry hay, manure, and damp earth. The kitchen had felt too small, the constant cries of the toddlers pressing against my temples until the room tilted. I just needed to stand where no one was touching me. David found me there, leaning against a timber post. He looked at my face and asked, "Are you feeling all right?" I gripped the rough wood until a splinter bit into my palm. I tried to use the smallest, safest words I could find. "I'm tired, David. I don't think my body can do this again so soon." He was quiet for a long moment, looking out the open barn door at the gray sky. There was no anger in his face, only a profound, immovable certainty. "That is not our decision to make, Rachel," he said softly. "Children are given by God. We receive what he gives. He wasn't trying to hurt me." He was simply repeating what the bishop preached from the bench, every second Sunday, what his father had told him, what the community required to keep its numbers growing. He was inside the exact same prison I was inside. He just couldn't feel the iron bars because they were painted to look like blessings. I looked down at my apron, nodded my head, and whispered, "Yes, David." I went back to the kitchen and began peeling potatoes for supper, my hands moving automatically while my spirit shrank a little smaller inside its shell. Then came the morning of my 6th pregnancy, when the crack in the wall finally appeared. I was standing at the stove, and the entire kitchen shifted violently to the left. The midwife came later that week, an English woman named Martha, who traveled to the plain settlements. She wrapped the tight black blood pressure cuff around my thin arm, pumped it up, and looked at the numbers. Then she looked at me. Not at my apron, not at my dress, but directly into my eyes with a look that felt like an interrogation. She leaned closer, speaking in a low voice that the children in the next room couldn't hear. After this baby arrives, Rachel, do you want to talk about spacing your pregnancies? There are ways. Something violent opened in my chest, a sudden gasp of cold air. For a split second, the world outside the frame seemed visible. But the fear was instantaneous. That's not something we do, I said, my voice tight, my fingers twisting the fabric of my apron. Martha didn't argue. She just nodded slowly, a deep, sorrowful look of recognition passing over her face, and wrote something down in her folder. She had seen this kitchen before. She had seen this exact look on a dozen other women's faces. I stood there after she left, my hand pressed hard against my swelling belly, the silence of the house suddenly echoing with a question I wasn't allowed to ask. The crack was there, and no matter how hard I prayed that night, I couldn't patch the plaster back together. Once you see the crack in the wall, you start noticing the architecture of the entire building. The very next Sunday, I sat on the hard wooden bench on the women's side of the church, the air thick with the smell of damp wool, heavy breath, and melting candle wax. I was pregnant again with my 6th or maybe my 7th. By then, the pregnancies had begun to blur together like the dark fence posts passing by a moving buggy window. My lower back throbbed with a dull white-hot heat, and my ankles were so swollen they strained against the leather of my shoes. The baby inside me kicked hard against my bladder, but I sat perfectly still. To stand up and relieve myself in the middle of a 2-hour sermon would draw the eyes of the entire bench, and attention was something women in my world were trained to avoid the way you avoid a roaring flame, as the minister's voice rose. Preaching from the Psalms about children being a heritage from the Lord, and a full quiver being a man's blessing, I looked down the row at the other women. I looked at Rachel, who was currently carrying her 9th child, her face gray with exhaustion. I looked at Leah, who had just buried her 4th infant in the frozen ground a month ago, and was already visibly thick with her 5th. I looked at Martha, whose hands were folded placidly over her apron, whose face was completely frozen into a mask of peace, and whose body had not been unpregnant for more than 6 months at a time in 12 long years. Not a single face changed. Not a single woman moved. And for the first time in my life, a terrifying thought bled into my mind. Were they doing what I was doing? Were they sitting inside that holy language and holding their breath, because holding still was the only option the architecture had left them? I didn't find the answer to that question until 2 years after I broke away. Sitting in a support group for people who had escaped plain communities, we met in a modern church basement, a place with plush carpet, bright electric lights, and the chemical hum of a plastic coffee maker down the hall. I sat next to a woman from a completely different settlement, a different state, an entirely different Ordnung. She had 9 children. I had 7. She told me her story in a flat, quiet voice, and it sounded like my own life being read back to me by a stranger. When she finished, she didn't cry. She just looked at me sideways, her fingers wrapping around her styrofoam cup, and said a sentence that has rattled around in my head every single day since. She said, "My husband was not the problem. My husband was the instrument." The song was written before either of us was born. I sat with that sentence in the quiet basement, letting it settle into my skin. If her husband, a man I had never met, living under a completely different set of rules about hat brims and buggy tops, had done the same things to her in the exact same gentle, unyielding way, then this was never just about David. It was about the song, and the song was a massive ancient theology that taught young wives that their bodies belonged entirely to their husbands, and through their husbands, directly to God. It was a rigid network of unwritten rules that treated any form of family planning as a sinful interference with divine will. It was a community structure that deliberately stopped a girl's education at the 8th grade, denied her any form of economic independence, and made the very thought of leaving functionally impossible through the terrifying weapon of shunning, the total tearing away of every face, every voice, and every hand you had ever known since birth. It was a system where a woman could never truly say no to a pregnancy because there was no safe place for that no to land. No doctor who would help her without her bishop finding out, No language where her refusal wasn't instantly twisted into the sin of selfishness. It wasn't a malicious conspiracy. No one sat in a dark room and designed this structure specifically to break women. It was something far more durable than a conspiracy. It was tradition. It was holy faith. And that is exactly what made it invisible. You cannot question the walls when you have been taught from infancy that the plaster is God's own hand. David was not a villain. He was a man who had been meticulously constructed by that very same architecture. He had been taught that loving his family meant filling his quiver, that his authority was a sacred responsibility given by the Creator. He was coercing me. I can say that word clearly now, but he didn't know he was doing it. The system made sure neither of us had the words to understand the theft. The only difference between us was that the architecture was designed to use my physical flesh and to reward his holy obedience with my total compliance from the height of my lived years now. Looking back at that farmhouse kitchen, I have finally begun to count what that compliance actually cost me. I count it the way you count things that are gone forever and can never be returned. Slowly, with your palms open, it cost me my physical body. 7 pregnancies in a single decade left me with a uterine prolapse that I didn't even have a medical name for until an English doctor looked at me with horror 3 years after I left and told me this pain wasn't normal. It cost me my teeth, which weakened and cracked because the calcium in my bones went to the babies, and no one ever told me to replace it. It cost me an anemia so profound and constant that I would find myself standing at the stove, staring into a pot of soup, completely forgetting what I was cooking because my blood didn't carry enough iron to keep my thoughts in a straight line. My body had become nothing more than a production line, and somewhere in the middle of that line, the human being inside stopped being a person and became a function. It cost me my presence with the children I already had. My little ones had a mother who was physically there, always, kneeling in the garden, scrubbing the floors, sitting at the table. But simultaneously, I was entirely gone. I couldn't sit on the floor and play with them. I was always too pregnant, too raw from recovery, too utterly depleted, too occupied with the next child arriving to be real for the ones who were already crying for my attention. They grew up with a ghost mother whose spirit lived somewhere far away, hiding behind her own eyes in that quiet place she had learned to go during the dark nights. And most terribly, it cost me my daughter's understanding of what it means to be a woman. They watched me. Every single day they watched their mother yield, submit, carry, and never once refuse. They learned from my silent compliance that a woman's body is a vessel to be used with permission from God and without permission from her. That is the lesson I burned into their minds, not with words, but with my terrifying silence. I stopped wanting things, not because I had reached some holy state of contentment, but because the act of wanting felt like open rebellion. And the one thing I wanted most, for my own body to belong entirely to me, was the most dangerous want of all. So I buried it. I buried it so deep under the linoleum and the canning jars that I forgot it was even there. Every video on this channel is a room that a woman finally chose to open. A room she was told to keep locked until her death. If you are in the middle of your own dark investigation right now, if you are uncovering rooms in your own past that you didn't know were there, you need to hear me. You are not alone in the dark. You belong here. The investigation that began with a microscopic crack in a kitchen wall finally ended on an ordinary Thursday afternoon, 2 years after I walked away. I remember driving past the local farmers market on the way to my appointment. The August peaches were in, stacked high in splitwood baskets, their bruised, sugary scent bleeding into the humid afternoon air. That smell instantly dragged me back to the suffocating heat of the canning stove, to the farmhouse, to everything. I sat on the couch in my therapist's office, my fingers instinctively pressing flat against my stomach. A quiet, modern habit I had formed to constantly remind myself that my womb was empty, that it was finally indisputably mine. I told her about the dream that hunted me every night, the farmhouse with no doors, the swelling beneath my apron, the feeling of a ceiling lowering onto my chest. My therapist listened, then leaned forward slightly, the way you lean towards someone when you are about to hand them a piece of heavy iron. She said, "Rachel, what you have been describing to me, the pregnancies you did not choose, the absolute refusal to let you wait, the system that erased your right to say no, there is a clinical term for that. It is called reproductive coercion." I sat entirely still in that quiet room, letting those two words settle against my skin. It was not a crying kind of feeling. It was a profound physical settling, like a joint that had been dislocated for 11 years, suddenly sliding back into its socket with a dull, correct click. The words didn't erase the damage, but they made the pain legible. It turned the heavy smoke inside my mind into a solid object I could finally set down on the table and examine from the outside. I was not bitter. I was not weak. I was a woman who had been systematically coerced into surrendering her own flesh. Years have passed since that Thursday afternoon. Today, I live in a world with electric lights and open roads, far from the county lines of my childhood. My relationship with my children is a quiet, ongoing resurrection. Some of them still carry the confusion of growing up with a mother who was physically present but spiritually hiding behind her own eyes. Rebuilding those bridges takes time, but my daughters are growing up knowing that their skin belongs strictly to them, no one else. And David, I have learned to hold the complex, exhausting truth of who he was. He was not a villain from a storybook. He was a man trapped inside the exact same architecture, rewarding his own holy obedience with my quiet compliance. The gentle father who carved miniature wooden horses by the winter fire is the exact same man who took my body in the dark without ever thinking to ask if I was ready. I do not have to choose between those two realities anymore. I hold them both real and entirely insufficient. We are taught that the structures we are born into are built by the hands of God, but the truth is far more fragile. They are built by men, sustained by silence, and protected by the absence of the words we need to fight back. Your knowing belongs entirely to you. What you find when you finally look through the cracks in your own life, whether it has a clinical name yet, or whether it is still just a heavy smoke in your chest, is real. No husband, no bishop, no tradition, dressed up as Holy Scripture, gets to tell you that your evidence isn't real. Looking at the walls is not a betrayal. It is the very first honest thing the system never wanted you to do. If you are carrying a memory in the dark that you have never been allowed to name, I want you to pour your soul into the space below. Tell me in the comments, what was the first thing you discovered about your own past that changed the entire shape of what you thought you knew? You do not have to explain the whole history. One single sentence is enough, because every sentence a woman dares to speak aloud becomes permanent evidence, and evidence, once spoken, can never be unspoken. Subscribe to this channel for our weekly stories, and stay with us as we continue to open every single room